The story of ancient Israel begins long before it became a kingdom, a state, or even a people with a land of their own. Its earliest roots lie deep in the shifting world of the ancient Near East, a land where empires rose and fell, where desert nomads wandered with their herds, and where new ideas of gods and covenants began to take shape. According to ancient tradition, the ancestors of Israel trace their story back to Abraham, a man remembered as leaving his homeland in Mesopotamia to journey toward a land that was promised to him and his descendants. Whether remembered as history, legend, or something in between, the story reflects a real pattern of the time. Small groups of Semitic-speaking tribes moving across Mesopotamia, Syria, and Canaan, following trade routes, rivers, and fertile valleys. The Hebrews were not alone in this movement. Amorites, Arameans, and other tribal peoples also drifted across the land, carving out places for themselves in the shadow of mighty empires. Abraham's family, through Isaac and Jacob, became part of this tapestry. Jacob's 12 sons were remembered as the ancestors of the tribes of Israel, each branch connected to a larger whole. Already, the idea of identity was forming, a people bound together by kinship, tradition, and a belief that their destiny was tied to a divine promise. The memory of famine and migration shaped their story too. Tradition tells of Jacob's family descending into Egypt, where they first found refuge. Over time, however, their fortunes shifted. What began as shelter turned into hardship, as they became laborers and outsiders in a foreign land. For centuries, Egypt dominated the politics of Canaan and the Levant, and it is within this reality that the early Israelite struggles were framed. Their story became not just about survival, but about liberation. At this stage, Israel was not yet a kingdom or even a settled nation. It was a people in the making, shepherds, farmers, wanderers who lived between the cracks of empires. Their tales of patriarchs and matriarchs preserved the memory of a fragile beginning. Promises made under desert skies, journeys across rivers and mountains, and a belief that, despite their smallness, they had a role to play in the unfolding drama of the ancient Near East. These foundations of migration, promise, and family ties became the bedrock of Israel's identity. And soon, their story would grow more dramatic, as hardship in Egypt gave way to one of the most defining narratives of their history, the Exodus. The Exodus stands as one of the defining memories of ancient Israel. The story tells of a people bound in labor in Egypt, yearning for freedom, and of a leader who rose to guide them out of bondage. Moses became central to this tradition, remembered as the figure who confronted Pharaoh, led his people through the wilderness, and delivered to them a covenant at Mount Sinai. At Sinai, according to tradition, Israel received not only freedom, but identity. Laws, commandments, and rituals shaped them into something greater than just a collection of wandering families. The covenant became the foundation of their relationship with their God, a belief that they were chosen, set apart, and bound by a moral and spiritual code. This moment of revelation turned the Israelites into a people united not just by ancestry, but by faith and law. The journey that followed was long and difficult. The wilderness became both a place of trial and of preparation. Generations passed as they moved through deserts and valleys, sustained by the promise of a land that had been spoken of since the days of Abraham. This land, Canaan, was not empty. It was home to many peoples: Canaanites, Amorites, Jebusites, and Philistines, each with their cities, gods, and armies. Entering Islam meant struggle, and the memory of conquest is preserved in tales of battles and victories, as well as failures and setbacks. Once they settled in Canaan, the Israelites did not form a kingdom right away. Instead, They lived as a loose confederation of tribes. Each tribe held its own territory, its leaders drawn from among warriors and elders. In times of crisis, charismatic figures known as judges rose to lead, not kings, but temporary leaders who defended the people against their enemies. Figures like Deborah, Gideon, and Samson appear in these traditions, remembered for their courage in battle and their ability to unite the tribes when survival was at stake. Yet, this period was fragile. The Israelites were surrounded by stronger neighbors, and internal divisions often weakened them. Without a central king or permanent army, they relied on kinship and faith to hold together. Their villages dotted the hills, their herds grazed in the valleys, and their altars rose on high places, each small community living close to the land, but always vulnerable to greater powers. The period of the judges reflected both freedom and instability. On the one hand, each tribe lived with a sense of independence, bound only loosely to the others. On the other, they faced constant threats from the Canaanites and, most notably, from the Philistines, a powerful people who had settled along the coastal plains with iron weapons and fortified cities. As pressure mounted, the Israelites began to look beyond temporary leaders. They sought something more permanent, a monarchy that could unite them, defend them, and perhaps even rival the great kingdoms around them. And so, the next chapter in Israel's history began, the rise of kings and the birth of a united monarchy. The call for a king changed everything. The Israelites, weary of disunity and threatened by powerful neighbors, especially the Philistines, desired a ruler who could unify the tribes into a nation. The first to take this role was Saul, a tall warrior from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul rallied the Israelites to battle and won victories against their enemies, but his reign was troubled. His rule revealed the challenges of monarchy. Loyalty was fragile, rival tribes questioned his leadership, and his relationship with religious tradition was uneasy. Though remembered as the first king, his reign ended in turmoil and tragedy as he fell in battle against the Philistines. Out of this chaos rose David, a shepherd from Bethlehem, whose name would echo across history. David's rise was marked by courage, remembered for his confrontation with Goliath, but more importantly, for his political skill. He united the tribes through both force and diplomacy, capturing Jerusalem and making it his capital. Unlike other cities, Jerusalem had not belonged to any single tribe, making it a neutral and unifying choice. From his palace, David expanded Israel's influence, fought successful wars, and established a dynasty that would define the nation for generations. But David's reign was not without shadows. Stories speak of family rivalries, rebellions, and moral failings that nearly tore the kingdom apart. Yet his legacy endured because he gave Israel something it had never had before, a strong, centralized kingdom tied to a sacred city. After David came his son, Solomon, whose reign is remembered as a golden age. Solomon consolidated the kingdom's wealth and power, forging alliances through trade and marriage with neighboring states. He oversaw massive building projects, the most famous being the first temple in Jerusalem, a house of worship that became the spiritual heart of Israel. With its golden decorations and sacred inner sanctum, the temple embodied the covenant in stone and symbol, a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant. Under Solomon, Israel became part of the wider network of ancient Near Eastern powers. Trade routes carried wealth into Jerusalem, and foreign envoys came to marvel at his court. But prosperity came at a cost. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and growing inequality stirred resentment among the tribes. When Solomon died, the fragile unity he and his father had built began to fracture. Old rivalries resurfaced, and the strain of wealth and power turned into division. The kingdom that David had forged would not last as one. Instead, it would split into two. Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The age of the united monarchy had been brief, yet it defined the memory of Israel. For centuries to come, kings would be measured against David, the temple would remain the center of faith, and the dream of a united kingdom would shape hopes and prophecies. But the coming centuries would be marked not by unity and prosperity, but by conflict, division, and the growing shadow of empires. With Solomon's death, the fragile kingdom unraveled. Old tensions between the tribes exploded, and by the late 10th century BC, Israel was divided. In the north arose the Kingdom of Israel, larger and wealthier, with capitals that shifted between Shechem, Tirzah, and finally Samaria. In the south stood the smaller but enduring Kingdom of Judah, ruled by the house of David from Jerusalem. What had once been a united people was now split, and the two kingdoms often found themselves as rivals, sometimes even as enemies. The north prospered through trade and agriculture, but its politics were unstable. Dynasties rose and fell through intrigue, assassinations, and coups. Idols and local shrines competed with the worship centered in Jerusalem, causing tension with religious traditions that stressed devotion to a single god. The south, though more stable under the Davidic line, faced its own struggles. It was poorer, more vulnerable, and at times forced into submission by stronger neighbors. Into this turbulent world came the prophets, voices that thundered against kings, priests, and people alike. In Israel, figures like Elijah and Elisha confronted corruption and idolatry, demanding faithfulness to their God, even as kings turned to foreign alliances and cults. In Judah, prophets such as Isaiah and Micah warned that injustice, greed, and arrogance would bring destruction. They proclaimed that no kingdom could survive if it forgot justice and righteousness, tying Israel's destiny not only to politics, but to moral and spiritual choices. As the prophets spoke, great powers loomed over the horizon. To the northeast, the Assyrians expanded relentlessly. Their armies feared across the ancient world. In the 8th century BC, Israel faced their might. Despite alliances and resistance, the northern kingdom fell. In 722 BC, the Assyrians captured Samaria, deporting much of the population and scattering them across the empire. These became remembered as the lost tribes of Israel. Judah remained, but it was now alone. Its kings tried to navigate between submission to Assyria and resistance, sometimes rebelling, sometimes yielding. The prophets of Judah declared that this survival was no accident, that Jerusalem had been spared for a reason, though they warned that if corruption continued, even Judah would not escape judgment. The fall of Israel was a turning point. It showed how fragile kingdoms could be against the might of empires, and how political failure was interpreted not just as defeat, but as a crisis of faith. For Judah, it was both a warning and a challenge to preserve what was left, even as the shadow of larger powers grew darker. But Judah's reprieve would not last forever. Another empire was rising in Mesopotamia, and its armies would bring fire and ruin to Jerusalem itself. The last centuries of the kingdom of Judah were an age of uncertainty. Assyria, the old terror of the Near East, collapsed by the late 7th century BC. But freedom for Judah was short-lived, for in its place rose a new giant, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II. Babylon became the dominant force of the region, and Judah, caught between empires, was once again trapped in the dangerous game of survival. At first, Judah paid tribute, bowing to Babylonian demands to preserve its independence. But tensions ran high. Some of Judah's rulers looked for opportunities to rebel, seeking alliances with Egypt, Babylon's rival. Others counseled submission, warning that resistance would only bring disaster. Among them was the prophet Jeremiah, who who urged the people to accept Babylonian rule, declaring that defiance would bring destruction. Yet many leaders chose defiance. The first rebellion ended badly. In 597 BC, Babylonian armies marched into Jerusalem, plundered the temple, and carried away many of the city's elite into exile. Among them was a young man named Ezekiel, who would later become one of the exilic prophets, interpreting the disaster not simply as politics, but as divine judgment. But the warnings went unheeded. A second revolt followed, this time far more disastrous. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar returned with overwhelming force. Jerusalem was besieged, and after months of suffering, the city walls were breached. The temple, the very heart of Judah's faith, was torn down, its treasures looted, and the city burned. Those who survived were taken into captivity, marched hundreds of miles to Babylon. What had once been the proud kingdom of Judah now lay in ruins. For the people, the destruction of the temple and the exile were not just political catastrophes, but spiritual ones. Their God's house was destroyed. Their king was dethroned. Their land was gone. Many wondered, had their God abandoned them? Was their covenant broken forever? Yet in the midst of despair, new forms of faith emerged. The exiles gathered in communities, preserving their traditions through scripture, prayer, and memory. Without the temple, they turned to texts, rituals, and teachings that could be carried wherever they went. This period saw the deepening of written traditions that would later form much of the Hebrew Bible. Meanwhile, not all of Judah's population was exiled. Those who remained lived under harsh conditions, rebuilding what they could from the devastation. They too wrestled with what survival meant when the core of their kingdom had been erased. Then, in the mid-6th century BC, hope came from an unexpected source. To the east, another empire was rising, the Persians, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. In 539 BC, Babylon itself fell without much resistance. For the Judean exiles, this was a turning point. Cyrus issued a decree allowing them to return to their land and rebuild their temple. For many, this moment was seen as nothing less than divine deliverance, the hand of history turning once again in their favor. The return was not simple. Not all exiles went back, and those who did faced a ruined land, hostile neighbors, and the difficult task of rebuilding not only their homes, but their faith. Yet from this struggle, a new identity began to emerge. A people bound together, not just by a kingdom or a temple, but by memory, law, and a renewed sense of covenant. The Babylonian exile was one of the greatest traumas in Israel's history, but it was also a moment of transformation. From loss and displacement came resilience and the beginnings of a tradition that would endure long after the great empires of the ancient world had crumbled into dust. The return from Babylon did not restore Israel to its old glory. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and challenging chapter. Under the rule of the Persian Empire, the exiles were allowed to go back, but the land they returned to was no longer the strong kingdom of David or Solomon. It was a small province within a massive empire, fragile and surrounded by powerful neighbors. Yet, despite the hardships, the people rebuilt. The Second Temple rose in Jerusalem by the late 6th century BC, standing as a symbol of renewal. Though simpler than Solomon's original, it restored a spiritual center for the community. Around it, life slowly revived, and the traditions of the people began to take on a more defined shape. Sacred texts were collected and edited, rituals were refined, and the covenant was re-emphasized. No longer was their faith tied entirely to kings or military power. Instead, it rested on memory, law, and worship that could endure even without political independence. Over the centuries, the region saw new masters. After Persia, the armies of Alexander the Great swept through, bringing Hellenistic culture and influence. Cities like Alexandria became centers of Jewish learning, where scripture was translated into Greek, spreading these traditions to new audiences. But Greek rule also brought tension, as foreign rulers tried to impose their culture and religion on the people. This tension erupted in the 2nd century BC with the Maccabean revolt, when Jewish forces resisted the Seleucid Empire and won a brief period of independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. It was a rare moment when the people once again ruled their own land. Yet even this independence was fragile, and soon another rising power entered the stage: Rome. By the 1st century BC, the Romans dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and Judea became a client kingdom and eventually a province. The Second Temple still stood, and life continued, but Rome's presence loomed large. Some accepted Roman rule, others resisted fiercely. Out of these centuries of conflict, longing, and cultural blending, new religious movements began to emerge, setting the stage for world-changing transformations. By the time the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD, the people of Israel had already learned resilience from centuries of survival, from Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and beyond. Their identity no longer depended solely on a kingdom of stone, but on a tradition of faith and memory that could be carried anywhere. It was this resilience, born of ancient struggles and enduring hope, that allowed their story to continue across millennia. And so, the history of ancient Israel is not simply the rise and fall of kingdoms. It is the story of a people who carried their beliefs through triumph and tragedy, who survived conquest and exile, and who transformed their faith into something that outlived empires. From the deserts of Sinai to the rivers of Babylon, from Jerusalem's heights to the far reaches of the Mediterranean, their journey shaped not only their own destiny, but the future of civilizations to come.